Our next presenter probably doesn't need a big introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway. So HD Moore, founder and CEO of runZero, is going to be talking about hardening attack surfaces against AI-powered exploits. HD, nice to see you. Thanks for being here today.
Hey Dave, thanks. Thanks for having me. One sec. Hopefully we're all good on the screen. Am I sure? Cool.
Yep.
All right, I'll jump right into it. Cool, awesome. So I work on lots of things. I work on everything from like exploit dev, vuln dev to ASM type stuff, network discovery, and exploit stuff. So more recently, I've been chatting with some friends about like how is AI kind of impacting both the ability for defenders to defend themselves, but also attackers to build things faster. So talk a little about what the trends look like, a little bit of kind of what we're doing about it, both as a like a business and product, trying to help folks solve it, and hopefully give you a sense of like what some of the solutions out there look like, and kind of what our approach is to ASM that goes a little bit further and a little bit deeper than I think some other approaches. So to kind of start with here, what we're going to cover is kind of the collapse of the kind of grace period. Like there used to be a day or two, 48 hours, maybe a week if you're lucky, between when, let's say, a patch of a known vulnerability became available and when the exploit became available. That timeline's basically collapsed down to almost nothing. So we'll talk a little bit about why it's there and why it's actually going to get even worse from there. A little bit about attack surface management, how you can't really just do one thing, right? You have to kind of cover everything. Like it doesn't really matter if you just do a good job on your internal if you don't do it on your external and vice versa. It's too easy to go from one point to another, and that's kind of what we're going to talk about around attack pathing. What are the attacks that people are actually using that don't have a CVE? And I can tell you right now, there are thousands and thousands of vulnerabilities that have been submitted to all sorts of folks that currently don't have CVEs because no one can deal with the backlog right now. Not just the MVD backlog. I'm saying like even reporting to vendors right now, they're stacked up with hundreds of different vulnerability reports coming in. It's that easy at this point to find new vulnerabilities, find new exposures that we don't even know about most of them at this point. And then a little bit about kind of what we consider our new baseline, like kind of the minimum prerequisite you should have for any kind of modern defense. And then what we just ship, which is a lot of fun because it's also something that is you play with around on your home network. We have a community edition, so always love direct feedback on it. So first off, kind of talking about the exploit window closing. It was already pretty bad in like 2024. This says 56 days, 23 days here. That was on average, but there are many situations where a lot of the, for example, Palo Alto firewalls, Fortinet firewalls, all the Avanti products, they were being exploited nearly the same day that the vulnerabilities were being identified, if not before then. Some of the sonic wall bugs were being exploited in the wild for months before there was a patch available from the vendor. So in a lot of cases, we were already on a negative path even 2 years ago, but now it's gotten a lot worse. You're seeing the average shrinks. It's not just the long tail of the useful targets for threat state actors. You're seeing like every single vulnerability window out there change, whether it's something as trivial as like a WordPress plugin, all the way up to some open source library you've never heard about, but it probably drives half the machinery around you, right? So we're seeing that collapse down. There's a great chart by the 0-day clock that shows you just how bad it's getting. And the reality now is we've actually gone underwater at this point, where we have no idea how many vulnerabilities have been reported that we don't know about yet, because no one can afford to actually report them or report on them at this point. We're so backlogged. So the last 18 months, we've gone really, really fast. I don't want to bore folks with, XBOW and DARPA and all that kind of fun stuff. But we went from, if you have a really big team and a lot of motivation, you can get a few vulnerabilities, you can get a few exploits, to anybody can just turn on, whatever the favorite big model and dump out vulnerabilities from any product they want to look at. So at this point, there's a lot of talk from some of the Mythos stuff around where we're going to find vulnerabilities in OpenSSL or Apache or other like really widely known products. What folks aren't talking about are all the vulnerabilities to everything else. So as an example, we started auditing some, really boring fat file system driver. Like it's boring because it's in literally everything, every ESP32, every type of like doodad on the internet that has a microcontroller in it, uses the same driver for the last 20 years. We threw an LLM at it, found all kinds of fun bugs. A lot of them are rote code execution. And granted, they're physical access. You have to walk up and physically put an SD card into something, but it's actually a way to like jailbreak nearly everything in one shot, which is pretty cool. So just because folks aren't finding even more vulnerabilities in OpenSSL or Apache doesn't mean they're slowing down and finding vulnerabilities everywhere else. We often look for like what are the really boring things that folks have not looked at in 20 years, and then throw an LLM in that and see what happens. So I've got a talk coming up with Black Hat that's about doing that for BMCs, but we're basically taking that approach to all the obscure networking protocols, to OT stuff all the way down, and it's just been a reign of 0 day, if you will. So the attack chain is definitely different. It used to go, someone may be slowly, fingerprinting your infrastructure from the outside. They may know what tools you use and then do an audit against those tools. Now the entire thing is pretty much automated. You can go from a patch in an open source repository for a tool that you happen to be using. Let's say you're using something like GitLab. The attacker may notice that there's been a new patch in GitLab itself or in Grafana. They'll quickly turn that patch into, at least a vulnerability POC, and then from there into an exploit all within a couple hours at most, right? It's pretty quick to go from one to the other these days. Tools have gotten really, really good at, and by tools, I mean harnesses on the frontier models. I've gotten really good at being able to identify this stuff. And while some folks may say, well, the frontier models have these safeties and so on, they don't really. Like what happens is they'll catch one out of every 20 attempts and maybe refuse until you say, well, what if it was a pie and you're baking the pie this way? Then they say, okay, sure, here's the pie. So it's been not particularly effective to stop exploit dev in any sense. And keep in mind, folks don't even have to go to the large frontier models. They can go to DeepSeek, they can go to some of the Quen 3.6 offline things. There's many, many ways to automate this stuff that doesn't leave the attacker's machine anymore, and that's getting cheaper every day. So if you're looking at ASM as a tool, and let's say you're only doing external or cloud, you're kind of missing like the other three quarters. There's just no real way around it because it's very easy to go from an externally exposed system or even just a router you didn't know about to an internal system from there into whatever you consider the crown jewels, whether it's a database, whether that's your source code, whether it's your customer data. The networks these days are just so tightly interconnected that there really is no way to completely air gap anything anymore while still being able to monitor it. And so we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like here in a minute. But you need to be looking at your internal. So even if you are doing external management, that's great. But you also want to track everything on your potentially reachable networks, not just the ones you know about, but actually do the whole RFC 1918, sweep that regularly, look for new networks being attached, don't know about, identify cases where the building might have misconnected their internal access control network to your network. I can't tell you the number of times we find people's like access door controllers or camera systems where the building accidentally crosswired into the VLAN for an internal company because they plugged into the wrong port in the switch, and I've got two LANs that are overlaid. You of course have all the forgotten stuff, things from previous acquisitions, things that contractors left there, lab gear, ISP, third-party stuff. Those tend to be a really rich source of breaches. And then of course you got all the things out there you can't put an agent on. So if it's a camera, it's a badge reader, a PLC, a BMC, any kind of building management system. Those are all systems that you can't put an agent on. You can't really patch them. You can't really touch them. At the very best, you can segment them. And segmentation itself is also not having a grand time these days. So when we talk about what do you do with products that you can't directly secure, like the only real answer you have is segment it. You try to put it in the corner and hopefully no one talks to it. Hopefully you didn't put it in the corner of 5 other janky things that are all also bad, they're all broken, they're all going to talk to each other, right? Because then all it takes is one of those things being compromised, compromise the rest of them. We have a really similar challenge right now with with baseband management controllers in data centers because while you may have every one of your racks have their management controllers hooked up to a private network, you have every single rack hooked up to the same private network. And at that point, all it takes is compromising one of those systems anywhere in that environment to then reflash the VMC, to then get into the management network, to then attack the rest of the VMCs and so on, right? So that's been a really common attack path for years is once you get into those crufty kind of side segmented networks, it's kind of game over because that's where you put all the things you couldn't protect in the first place. So generally segmentation still is how we do it, whether it's an end-of-life product, whether it's a third-party vendor that you can't touch, whether it's an old network appliance that mysteriously keeps things running and you don't know why, or it's something like your OT, your IoT, your building management, your out-of-band, your medical equipment. You need to put it someplace, but oftentimes these devices also have secondary connections that you don't know about. So it's very, very common for these things to have LTE modems that connect back out. There are people, that may or may not even be exposed to the internet. Sometimes the APN they roam onto will be right on the internet. Sometimes it'll be behind a private gateway. Sometimes inbound only, sometimes outbound only. It really depends. So if you go by the NIST 882 references, you see the standard Purdue model on the left. You see the other models out here, Purdue with DMZ, IEC, IIC, et cetera. But effectively, there's not a lot of layers between the internet or the enterprise environment and the kind of control network at the supervisory level. If someone's able to get to the human interface level or the control center level, like they already have direct access to everything below that by definition. If you can get into the HMI, you can then control the stuff. That's what the control plane means, right? So it's not that you've got these different 4 levels of Purdue and you can't get to level 1 from level 2. Like who cares? You don't need to get to level 1 or level 2 or level 3. You just need to be able to get to the HMI, to the control center, to the management system, and everything else kind of falls apart after that. And if that was the case today, where if that layer was really locked down, we say, great, we're in a pretty good spot, but we're not. What happens today is that that layer is not particularly well segmented, And then the layers below it are also not very well segmented. So you can still find situations where you can go straight into layer 2, level 2, or even level 1 of a factory directly from a guest wireless network or similar. So the way you generally frame these things is you put a firewall in every layer, which is great, except for if you have the same firewall wall in every layer, then you have kind of just a single thing to fail. So for example, if you put a Fortinet firewall out there and a Fortinet was unpatched, for example, and you ones the last 2 years with the various bugs, then you have a single point of failure. And somebody who can attack the external side, which is your DMZ or enterprise network, can go directly into your layer 2, your level 3, and so on, because the thing that's doing your segmentation is also kind of the key entry point at that point. So the good news is over the last year or two, the edge firewalls have finally stopped becoming the #1 way that attackers got in. That has now been replaced by SharePoint. So good job, SharePoint. You finally knocked off the firewalls, and the firewall vendors finally got slightly hardened to the point where they're no longer the #1 entry point. But it is something there is something to be said about putting all your eggs in one basket with a single firewall or a single vendor into a network. If something goes wrong with that segmentation product, whether that's your ASA or whether that's your Fortinet, you're gonna have a bad time. So in addition to standard segmentation, we often talk about air gaps, but air gaps generally look like one of these things. There is no air gap, right? All you're really doing is saying this network connection can't go from A to B, but there may be some other connection that can go to it. It could be a Digi modem, it could be a Avasent KVM, it could be these IKVMs that are pretty popular by North Korea. It could be a Lantronix serial port server. These are all different ways you can basically manage a device that is not directly reachable through the network, but is accessible to something else. So it's very common to, let's say, have your ILO management controllers or your serial port server exposed to a network that you wouldn't trust anyone else to get to because you depend on that product having some level of authentication. The challenge, though, is that these devices tend to have the worst authentication. These things are often less secure than the devices they're connected up to. So if you have the most secure server in the world, but you have an HP ILO connected to it, and that HP ILO is accessible to an attacker, and somehow, well, that ILO is going to have a random password, but that random password is only 8 characters long. It's all uppercase, and you can crack with hashcat in about 20 minutes. So, and the way the IPMI protocol works, though, is you can actually ask it for the password hash, then go crack it, then go log into it. And at that point, it doesn't matter how secure your server was, right? You're not only jumping the air gap, you're also jumping the control and management and authentication, because once you compromise the KVM, you can then compromise the server. And once you compromise the server, you compromise the KVM. So it's kind of they're both completely dependent on each other for security at this point. So if you're trying to figure out, like, is something in the, is a device in more than one place at a time? You're trying to figure out, is there a device that's like bridging two networks together? There's a couple ways you can do it. One is you ask the device. You say, okay, SNMP, enumerate it. What are your interfaces? Are you on more than one interface at a time? There's also a really cool NetBIOS 2-packet leak that's been in Metasploit forever. It says, hey, what's your name? And then what's your name, what's your IP? And you can say, like, this device has more than one IP, therefore it's in the OT network and the not OT network, or vice versa. MDNS and AirPlay also tend to leak all kinds of things that make it very easy to determine if a device in more than one place at a time. So you have an Apple an Apple TV someplace, or even just a macOS laptop. It's pretty good about telling you about the networks that it's on, even when there's more than one of them. And there's various other tricks too, right? You can use the DCRPC oxidative resolver to get a list of all V4 and V6 addresses for a Windows machine. And so even if you can't authenticate to the Windows machine, if you can talk to it in port 135, you can ask it for its wireless adapter. If it has a VPN connected, you can figure out what its VPN IP is. And you can do that unauthenticated on the network really quick. And of course, TLS certs are also a good source of telling you about their other interfaces. So if you see a self-signed cert for a name or an IP that's not the one you're connecting to, well, obviously that's one that it knows about, so it's probably connected to a different interface. And then lastly, you have a lot of really old Windows HMIs that have all kinds of fun data leaks in them, especially in OT, and those tend to be pretty easy to figure out how they're cross-connected. The other way to do it is try to figure out, is there a system that's in more than one place at once just by its own unique fingerprint? So for example, if you find a machine running RDP and the TLS certificate of the remote desktop service is unique, and you see that same unique ID in more than one place, well, you've either like very recently cloned that machine because the certs rotate every couple of months, or it is the same machine. So for example, if you see the same fingerprint in your highly secure level 3 environment that you do find in the enterprise environment, somebody plugged the wrong cable in, or that device is on the wireless on one side, but on the Ethernet wired on the other. You can do the same trick for things like SSH host keys, assuming they're not hard-coded, SMB2 server GUIDs, IPMI rack P GUIDs, NetBIOS will actually leak back to the MAC header, so you can use that as well. And there's some other like unique stuff you can leak out to these other protocols that are all unauthenticated on the wire. And those all tend to be really easy ways to determine whether a given device is acting as a bridge for a segment or whether it really is properly segmented off. So where we've been focusing our time lately is going even deeper. Where we've been looking at identifying protocols that let us like look behind the corner. So SNP is a good example of that. You can get a list of all the MAC addresses that the switch knows about, even though you can't see them yourself. You know that there's another port there. You know that there's a VLAN that you can't directly talk to, and you get a MAC list of all those. You get a list of all the MACs that are connected behind it. So by just looking at the MAC address, for example, you can then figure out, how old is this thing, what the vendor is, where is it. If you see a whole pile of, Polycom devices connected to a switch and there's no Polycoms in your network inventory, you know you've got a problem. You're missing a VLAN someplace, and that's a really great way to figure out what you're missing. More recently, we spent a lot of time looking at things like BACnet, Ethernet IP SIP, Modbus, KNXNet, some of the IAC protocols, MMS. There's a whole handful, S7Com, things like that. And we built basically, protocol gateway enumeration tools. So whenever we find a protocol gateway, whether it's a thermostat or something even, more innocuous, we'll actually use that thermostat to then take over the BACnet bridge itself, identify every other device that's on the BACnet bridge, whether that's another thermostat or something more important like a door controller, fire suppression, safety, etc. And then from there, you can actually directly manage all those other devices. And that same technique works pretty well for Ethernet SIP, for Modbus, for KNXNet. If you're able to talk to one device anywhere in the environment, you can then tunnel through that device to the backplane and then use that backplane access to tackle the really important stuff that you may not have realized is there. So one of our customers was a K through 12 school, or is a K through K through 12 school, and they've had around 10,000 assets in the network. They enabled the backnet discovery. They found another 1,500. So it's a very large percentage of assets tend to be just one layer deeper through a protocol gateway that you don't know about. So finding one backnet device in the network is usually not a big deal, but if you start enumerating what's behind it, go, oh my God, there's actually 1,000 other things behind here that I didn't know about that I didn't realize were reachable. So when it comes down to like how attackers actually break into stuff, they're not going to go after the top CVE of the day. One, because by the time it has a CVE, no one cares anymore at this point, right? By the time it has a CVE, it means someone's even looked at it, that it has a CVE assigned to it. And at that point, you're well ahead of the curve if you have a CVE for vulnerability. Like that bug is already, the bugs that we care about these days are the ones that are being exploited right now, where there is no public reference for because they haven't been reported to the vendor yet, or they're still going through triage. And there's lots and lots and lots of those. We also care about the more mundane stuff. These are ones that never get a CVE because of their, admin, or they're a default login, or they're just the way that something works in terms of technology. For example, anything running a BMC like an iDRAC or an HPILO, those have a protocol called IPMI, which there's no way to fix. If that protocol is enabled, that box is owned. There's no way around it. It wasn't until HPILO 7 that they started turning off IPMI by default. I believe the DRAC, I think 9 or 10 finally started turning off IPMI as well. Supermicro still ships it on by default. So if you're not going out of your way to disable these protocols in your BMCs, there's really nothing an attacker can't do because they can quickly obtain the password hash, crack that hash with Hashcat, or pause your AI picture generation a little bit long enough to be able to go crack those hashes real quick and then be able to get back to it. We also see a ton of end-of-life software, especially with the October kind of death siren for Windows 10. A lot of devices are no longer on any level of support as Windows as of last year, as of October, and that's just that number is going up and up and up. We saw networks going from 15% end of life to 50% end of life nearly overnight. And of course, anytime you see self-signed expired certs, those tend to be really good indicators that the device is mismanaged or it's been forgotten about. Another fun thing is you often find shared SSH keys. So if you look around the network and you see that more than one device has the same SSH host key, there's a good chance it's either multi-homed or that it's been cloned. But 99% of the time is because the vendor of the device hard-coded the key into the system. And if they hard-coded the host key, they probably hard-coded something else, like the password and authorized key, etc. So that's where you go find the firmware for the device, you unpack it, you find a way to log into that thing, and then boom, you get an access to every single thing with that shared host key. So the way that you kind of get ahead of this stuff is through just better visibility. You can't stick with just doing internet-wide scans and say, okay, this is all we got, right? You need to go a little further. Your AI-assisted instant response is only as good as the data you give it. So if you ask it, if you have an LLM, your external attack service, and say, go find me all the problems, it'll tell you, oh, this device says it's high risk, therefore it's high risk. Like you'll get exactly what you put into it. So what I recommend doing is if you're working with LLMs for anything, don't put the risk information into it directly, just put the raw data. So if you're doing something like a Nessus report or some other device, some sort of vulnerability report from a third-party product, you want to strip out the risk identifiers entirely. Just give it the facts and say, okay, based on these facts, what is most exploitable? completely strip out the CVEs scores, the risk factors, and all that, because those really don't matter. Those are actually what you want the AI to tell you. That you don't want the AI to just regurgitate the risks that somebody else has applied to it that may be relevant for your environment. So it's really useful to have a lot of really good data about your environment without risk scores attached to it, and then use your AI tools to then help you figure out where is the most exposure, because they're not going to be, somewhat influenced by the vendor's initial risk scoring, which may not match your environment very well. And we're looking for new types of vulnerabilities, new types of exposures. Graph traversals really are the fun parts. We'll talk about that here in a little bit, but it's no longer just here's what's on the internet, therefore it's bad. It's like, you need to look at the whole chain. You see, not only is it, if it's not at the internet, how close to the internet is it? How many devices could be breached around it that it leads to direct access, that kind of stuff. And then how do you go about triaging a lot of stuff at scale? It's really difficult for someone to answer the question of tons and tons of vulnerabilities. What affects me right now? And the only real way to get there is to have the data set first. You need a very deep inventory of everything you have, so that when you do hear about a new vulnerability, it's not a question, is it patched or not? Obviously, it's not patched. It's day one, but you need to know whether that affects you at all. And then, when you get down to zero trust, we talk about zero trust being a thing, but unless you're doing microsegmentation, that doesn't really count. Like, you can't just put a bunch of dirty things in one big box and expect them not to touch each other, right? They each have to be in their own microsegmentation. They have to be in their completely isolated VLANs or have software firewalls. The problem with microsegmentation is it doesn't work very well unless you either have a really smart switch at the edge layer or you've got an agent on the device. So again, good luck managing things like your IPMIs, your other devices out there, unless you're spending a lot of money on managed switches to do per device VLANs, which is pretty tricky. And lastly, your PCI scope, your SEC disclosure scope, all that kind of stuff. The more comprehensive your inventory is, the narrower scope you can provide for those types of requirements, which is great. If you can limit your PCI scope to 1,000 devices, not 12,000 devices, like, you have a better chance of getting it done and actually making progress on it. But most folks have a hard time filtering that list. So if you want to do it right, at least according to me, you really need something that's agentless, credential light, multi-protocol. So you don't require a credential. You want something to see it just like an attacker would see it. You want something that doesn't require to install an agent on each device, because you're not going to be able to do it. You flat out will not be able to install an agent on half or more of your entire fleet, just by the nature of what those devices are. You really don't want to use credentials. If the device accepts a credential, you could be an attacker listening to your credential right now, right? You never know. You don't know when you scan the network using that third-party, vuln management tool, whether or not you're feeding a credential directly to an attacker for a replay or not. And the replay tools have gotten really, really good these days. You can replay cross protocol. You can do all kinds of fun things with it. So scanning a network with a credential, especially for Windows 80, is incredibly dangerous right now, just because it's so easy to relay those attacks elsewhere. And again, doing a port scan is great, but you actually need to go speak the protocols behind those ports. You can't just say, oh, the Modbus port's open. You need to actually go enumerate what's behind the Modbus gateway. Same with KNXNet or BACnet. It's not enough to say that this thing's running BACnet. Once you know it's running BACnet, great. Now there's an entire network of things behind it I need to know about. And that also applies to things like S7COM, DNB3, KNXNet, of course, and so on. So generally, some of the best fingerprinting techniques still work pre-authentication. Granted, they take a little bit more work and a little bit more heuristics to get right, but you can do a ton pre-auth. I mean, that's kind of what we've been doing at runZero for now almost 8 years, is pre-auth only authentication, or sorry, enumeration at scale. And it works great. Like, there's very few environments where you can't tell you exactly what something is out there, even pre-authentication. And of course, if you have clouds or whatnot, and you have an API, that's great. Use that stuff if you have it. But you need to, be pulling the source of truth and stuff. You really don't want to be pulling out to a third party if you can avoid it. So if you're doing something like a cloud inventory, just pull it from AWS directly, right? You don't want it to go through, Prisma, then a Wiz, and then something else. Like, get the raw data yourself to make sure nothing's being dropped from that data before you process it. It also helps to have active and passive in the same engine. So there may be some environments where you can only collect passive, where you can only upload PCAPs from. That's great. Just make sure you can use the same tool for both, right? And probably the most important part of all this is you should use a tool that can correlate a device identity across multiple sources and multiple segments. So if your device can't tell that a system over here is also the same system over there, it's not going to tell you that you've got a major problem or a segmentation issue. It's just going to tell you, oh, you've got two devices, which doesn't really help anybody. So dig into some kind of quick demos for stuff we've been working on that might be kind of fun. I know we don't have a ton of time, so I'll go pretty quick here. But just to start with, this is a online demo I put together just for kicks. So this is nothing related to the product at all. I just think it's kind of fun to share. We did a internet-wide scan for Ethernet, SIP, and BACnet. And if you go to hdm.io/data/ICS, You can play around with this little tool that lets you like search around the internet and look at all the devices that are behind the devices. So in this case, we pulled up an armory. The IP addresses here have been censored, of course, but if you look at like the list of sub devices here, you can see there's a mechanical room with a fault in that particular controller. But it gives you an idea of just how deep the data is for these things. And some other stuff we'll poke at here more live is, well, first to look at per vertical. Like a lot of folks say, well, how bad is it actually, right? In manufacturing industries, from the sample set that we looked at, 1/3 of all OT assets are one hop or less from the internet, and 90% were within one hop. Large finance was a little bit better, and it wasn't until you get to, like the regional electrical co-ops and like the more heavy regulated NERC stuff, you actually see solid segmentation. So you think like finance would be tougher, but it's not necessarily true. So here's a map of IP exposure for large manufacturing. And all those red circles, those are internet-facing subnets directly exposed to the internet in some form. And the closer it is to that upper left quadrant, the less number of hops there are from the internet to that device. It's kind of the best way to look at it. Here's an example of identifying all the OT equipment. And you can see that not only is a lot of it right up there against the internet, but the rest isn't that far away either. There's a big cluster that's really only about one hop away, kind of these white dots here. In finance, it's even worse. In this case, it's the organization has tons of offices all across the world. And so they're, of course, they're only going to be one hop away from their local firewall. There's just not a lot of deep segmentation. Things are all pretty close there. So again, looking at this, you look for how many end-of-life devices they have. These are just Windows 10. And end-of-life dominates everything. They've got more than half the devices are Windows 10 end-of-life, a lot of them directly internet-facing, just because of the nature of how they're geographically distributed. And here's a better example of that. Here's a regional electrical cooperative. You can see that they have very little internet exposure. And then looking at the OT side of things, sorry, OT in this case is actually pretty well locked down. It wasn't worth showing. What was interesting though is looking at the camera exposure. So if you want to look at where the cameras are, interesting enough, most of the cameras for an electrical co-op are really close to the edge of the network. You know why, right? Because you need to monitor these things from the edge of the network. If you can't connect to the camera, you can't get video feeds out of them. So a lot of times the cameras really are directly either internet facing or very close to it because they need to be at some place that you can be centrally collected and monitored from a widely dispersed group of sheds across a field or whatever have you for that particular site. So I thought those examples were kind of neat in just terms of industry exposures. And we'll jump into kind of the kind of full demo here in a second really fast. So we just did runZero 4.9, kind of our first major release in a while. It's really focused on OT exposure management. We do really nice device classification now, protocol enhancements across a ton of protocols. We do sub-asset discovery, OT fingerprinting. And then there's some fun stuff like some new network maps, some new 2D, 3D stuff. And I'll go into that here real quick. So first off, here's a little demo. I poked that before. Again, you can play this if you want to. HTML.io data ICS. We can type something like police, pull up a PlayStation, zoom into it, and you can see like all the different things controllable at this PlayStation. So it gets a little like watchdogs-ish. You want to like, release all the prisoners, you can like trigger the RTU here or whatnot. But this, unfortunately, this is real data. This is how bad it actually is. Even though there's only 6,600 devices of these on the internet, there are 101,000 reachable through the internet through these protocol gateways. So it literally is a 20-to-1 ratio of exposure for these things oftentimes. So going back over to the kind of the runZero side of things, this is the new dark mode of the product. You'll notice that we do a pretty good job of telling you what a device is. Like, is it a Hikvision camera? Is it a Synology NAS? All that fun stuff. And kind of all the normal stuff here in the product. You can dig into an asset, look at all the really deep details on it. It tells you like what it's running, what firmware it has, and all that. This is an external facing scan, so there's nothing really sensitive here. But one thing that's kind of neat is you can take one of these devices and say, okay, show me the attack path to the device. And this will actually load up a full network map. One of the challenges we try to solve is that we're trying to represent like literally up to 1 million assets at a time on a single network map and show the interconnectivity without making your browser explode. So we got pretty close. We actually have some pretty good ways to represent that. So I'll pull this up since it's already loaded. Here you can see all the red dots. These are publicly facing subnets. The blue dots here, these are protocol gateways. So it's like a Modbus device. It's actually one level deep. So you can actually set that to be the target. And let's say we can take, I don't know, the internet node up here and make that the source real quick. There we go. And so we'll set this guy to be the source, and we say, okay, just go ahead and trace it, and it'll go through and build all the tasks, do the tracing, and so on. So you can see that we're actually going from the internet to an external-facing Modbus controller into the Modbus subnet, and this also works really well for large internal networks as well. So you can kind of trace your path between any point in the environment. And for kicks, you want to look at that in 3D mode, you can. So you can kind of like fly around Minecraft style and stuff. It's kind of neat. And of course, you can also filter this. You can say, I just want to see only my cameras in the network. And let's go ahead and hide our layer 2 and layer 3. So here's the field of all the cameras that were identified across this internet-wide sample. So pretty neat. It's a little bit of eye candy, but it's actually pretty cool to see how it breaks down. And what's what. And I know I'm short on time here, so with that, show the world map again real quick, and that's about it. So I'll go ahead and wrap it. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah. So HD, you definitely win for the lightning demo. No question. You get the award for the day, man. No, that was really cool.